Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight, we drift back across 5 centuries into a cold, mist-laced corner of Eastern Europe, where the mountains bite at the sky and the rivers run dark, and where a single man's name still makes grown historians lower their voices. You can almost feel the chill of it already, that damp forest air settling over your shoulders like a borrowed cloak. Somewhere beyond the tree line, torches flicker along a wooden palisade, and the whole land seems to be holding its breath. This is Wallachia, and you have just wandered into the shadow of the most feared prince who ever lived. A ruler whose reputation was so monstrous that honestly, you probably won't survive this journey with all your comforting assumptions intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I would love to know where in the world you are drifting off from tonight, so if you feel like it, drop your location and your local time down below, because there is something lovely about imagining all of us scattered across the planet, sinking into the same story at once. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on a muddy road, and the year, if anyone here bothered to keep a proper calendar, is somewhere in the middle of the 1400s. The mud, you should know, is going to be a recurring character. Wallachia in this era is not the sort of place with paved plazas and tidy fountains. It is a rugged, half-wild principality wedged between 2 enormous hungry powers, and the ground beneath your boots has soaked up more history than you would ever want to think about while trying to fall asleep. To your south sprawls the Ottoman Empire, a rising superpower whose armies seem to swallow kingdoms for breakfast. To your north and west loom the Kingdom of Hungary and the tangled politics of Christian Europe. And poor little Wallachia sits directly in the middle, like a lamb that has volunteered to referee a fight between 2 wolves. The man you have come to meet was born into this squeeze, and his name was Vlad. History would eventually hang 3 separate titles on him, and each one tells you something. The first is Vlad III, a plain bureaucratic sort of name, the kind you would find at the top of a very intimidating tax document. The second is Vlad Dracula, which sounds thrillingly gothic to your modern ears, but originally meant something closer to Son of the Dragon, a family nickname we will untangle in just a little while. And the third, the one that echoes down the corridors of nightmare, is Vlad the Impaler. You can probably guess how he earned that one. If not, well, you will find out. And I promise to keep it firmly within the bounds of good taste, because this is a bedtime story and not a horror film, no matter how hard the subject matter tries to wander in that direction. Here is your first solid mainstream historical fact to tuck under your pillow. He was a real documented ruler of Wallachia who held the throne on 3 separate occasions across the 1400s, and he really did use impalement, that grim method of execution, as a signature tool of both punishment and psychological warfare. This is not folklore. Chroniclers of his own time, some friendly and many decidedly not, wrote down what they saw and heard, and the pattern is consistent enough that no serious scholar disputes the broad outline. He was a warlord in an age of warlords, and even by the blood-splattered standards of his neighbours he stood out. But here is the quirky little twist that most people never learn, the fringe tidbit for tonight. In modern Romania, Vlad is not remembered primarily as a vampire or a ghoul at all. To a great many Romanians, he is a national hero, a fierce defender of his homeland, a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. There are statues of him, there are streets named after him, there are proud schoolchildren who could tell you about his defiance of the Sultan the way children elsewhere might tell you about their own founding legends. The bloodthirsty count sucking necks in a Transylvanian castle is largely an invention of Western imagination stitched together long after Vlad was dust. And that gap, that enormous canyon between the man and the myth, is exactly the territory we are going to explore. And this is where things get delightfully murky, because historians still argue whether the surviving accounts of Vlad's cruelty are honest reporting or exaggerated propaganda dreamed up by his many, many enemies. You will find as we go that almost every juicy story about him comes to us second-hand, filtered through people who either adored him or wanted him dead, with very little neutral ground in between. Trying to find the real Vlad is a bit like trying to describe a person based only on their most enthusiastic fan and their most bitter ex. Somewhere in the overlap sits the truth, and we will spend our night gently prying it loose. So picture him now, this figure at the center of it all. The portraits that survive show a man with dark, heavy-lidded eyes, a long face, a prominent nose, and a thick mustache draped over a set mouth. He does not look friendly. He looks frankly like someone who has never once been asked to smile for a group photo and would refuse on principle. There is intelligence in that face, and there is danger, and there is something unreadable that has kept people guessing for over 500 years. You are going to get to know him rather well tonight, from his cradle in a nest of dragons to his cold, contested death in the snow, and by the end, you may find your own opinion of him has shifted more than once. For now, though, just hold that face in your mind. Let the torchlight settle, and let us begin at the very beginning with the dragon that gave him his name. To understand the son, you must first understand the father, and to understand the father you have to travel a little further back, still to a moment when a nervous emperor tried to save Christian Europe with a fancy club. That is not sarcasm, or at least not entirely. The story of Vlad's family truly does begin with an order of knights, a golden emblem, and a dragon curled in on itself. And you are about to meet the man who wore that emblem with genuine pride. His name was Vlad II, and he was your Vlad's father, which already tells you the family was not brimming with imaginative baby names. In this era, being handed a father's name was a badge of continuity, a way of saying you belonged to a line, and this particular line had ambitions. The elder Vlad was a member of a warrior fraternity called the Order of the Dragon, and here is your mainstream fact for the evening, so settle in. The Order of the Dragon was a real chivalric order, founded in the early 1400s by Sigismund the Holy Roman Emperor, with the explicit purpose of defending Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire and other perceived enemies of the faith. Members swore oaths, wore an insignia of a dragon devouring its own tail, and pledged their swords to the cause. It was part holy brotherhood, part elite social club, and part very serious military commitment. And Vlad the Elder was inducted into it with all the pomp such a thing deserved. Now here comes the delightful piece of wordplay that has confused people for centuries. The word for dragon in the old Romanian tongue was drac, and so once Vlad the Elder joined the Order of the Dragon, the local population began calling him Vlad Dracul, meaning Vlad the Dragon. Perfectly heroic, perfectly noble, exactly the sort of nickname a man might want carved on his tomb. But language is a slippery, mischievous thing, and over time the very same word drac drifted in meaning until it also came to mean devil. So the son of Vlad Dracul became known as Dracula, son of the dragon, which was intended as an honor, a proud dynastic label. Yet to later ears, especially foreign ones unfamiliar with the original meaning, it could just as easily be read as son of the devil. You can see already how a reputation might curdle purely through the accident of a shifting vocabulary. Vlad never chose the devilish reading. History chose it for him, one mistranslation at a time. Let me set the scene of his early childhood, because the sensory details matter. Little Vlad, our Vlad, was most likely born in a town called Sighisoara in the region of Transylvania sometime around the 1430s. Picture a fortified hill town of steep cobbled lanes, timber-framed houses leaning together like gossiping neighbours, and a tall clock tower keeping watch over the whole huddle. The air would have smelled of wood smoke and horses and the sharp tang of the surrounding forests. Winters bit hard here. Snow would have muffled the streets, and the boy would have grown up watching armed men come and go, hearing hushed adult conversations about the Sultan, about tribute, about which powerful neighbour to trust this particular season. It was not a childhood of carefree meadow frolics. It was a childhood soaked in the awareness that his family sat on a very precarious perch. And the perch really was precarious, because Wallachia, remember that lamb refereeing wolves, demanded a ruler who could somehow please the Christian powers to the north and the Ottoman power to the south. At the same time, an act of political balancing that would give anyone chronic indigestion. Vlad Dracul, the father, tried valiantly to walk this tightrope. He had sworn his dragon oath against the Ottomans, and yet when the political winds shifted, he found himself forced into uneasy dealings with the very Sultan he had pledged to resist. This constant switching of loyalties was not cowardice so much as survival, but it planted seeds of distrust everywhere, and those seeds would eventually bear very bitter fruit for his children. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for tonight, and it is a good one. That dragon symbol, the one that gave the family its name, has been suggested by some enthusiasts as a distant thread connecting Vlad to the whole later mythology of monstrous otherworldly creatures. The self-devouring dragon, the Ouroboros-like emblem, the word that meant both dragon and devil, all of it forms a kind of eerie coincidence that vampire storytellers centuries later found irresistible. There is even a charming bit of speculation that the emblem itself with its serpentine coils contributed to the visual imagination of Gothic writers. Whether any of that is true or simply a case of connecting dots that were never meant to touch is anyone's guess. And I rather love that ambiguity, because naturally historians still argue whether the young Vlad grew up genuinely steeped in this crusading dragon oath ideology, or whether the family's frequent flip-flopping between Ottoman and Christian alliances left him with a far more cynical, pragmatic view of the world from the very start. Was he raised to be a holy warrior, or was he raised to be a survivor who would say whatever kept his head attached to his shoulders? The evidence points in both directions, and the truth is probably a messy blend of the two, which, if you think about it, describes most complicated people rather well. What is certain is that Vlad entered the world already carrying weight. He had an older brother named Mircea and a younger brother named Radu, who will become terribly important later, so tuck that name away somewhere safe. He had a father balancing on a political knife edge, a family emblem that doubled as a curse in translation, and a homeland that everyone bigger wanted to control. He was, in essence, born preloaded with conflict, a child of the dragon in a nest that was never truly safe. And that lack of safety was about to become horribly literal, because the fragile bargain his father struck with the Sultan would soon require a very personal, very frightening form of collateral. It would require handing over 2 of his sons. And one of those sons, as you have surely guessed, was our Vlad. The bargain came due the way such bargains always do, quietly at first and then all at once. Picture the moment when your father, that tightrope walking Vlad Dracula we just left balancing over the abyss, is summoned to meet the Sultan and finds himself to his horror detained. To buy back his own freedom and to prove his loyalty to the Ottoman throne, he agreed to leave behind a guarantee of his good behavior, and, in the political vocabulary of the age, a guarantee meant hostages. It meant children. And so you, young Vlad, along with your little brother Radu, remember I told you to keep that name close, were handed over into Ottoman keeping to be held as living insurance that your father would not break his word again. Here is your mainstream historical fact for tonight, and it is one of the most consequential in the entire story. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were indeed held as hostages by the Ottomans, most likely from the mid-1440s onward during their formative teenage years. This is well documented and widely accepted. It was not, however, quite the dank dungeon experience your imagination might be conjuring. Being a royal hostage in the Ottoman court was a strange, gilded, deeply unsettling arrangement. You were a guest and a prisoner, at the same time treated with a certain courtesy, given an education, and yet always aware that your continued good treatment depended entirely on the behavior of relatives hundreds of miles away, over whom you had absolutely no control. Imagine being grounded for something your dad might do next Tuesday. Now imagine the punishment for his misbehavior could be considerably worse than losing your phone privileges. The court itself would have dazzled and terrified you in equal measure. The Ottomans were at the height of their sophistication, and everything around you spoke of a power far greater than anything back home in muddy little Wallachia. There were tiled courtyards catching the sun, fountains murmuring in shaded gardens, scholars debating in cool marble halls, and an army whose discipline and scale must have made your father's ragtag forces look like a village fair by comparison. You would have learned the Turkish language, studied the Quran alongside logic and philosophy and the arts of war, and become fluent in the customs of the very empire your family had sworn to oppose. In a sense, the Ottomans were raising you to be a useful, obedient client prince, someone they could one day install on the Wallachian throne as their loyal puppet. That was the plan anyway. But plans and people are unpredictable, and the 2 brothers responded to captivity in profoundly different ways, which is your quirky, revealing tidbit for the evening. Radu, the younger, softer boy, adapted. He was handsome, charming, and pliable, and he grew comfortable in the Ottoman world, eventually earning the nickname Radu the Handsome, and forging genuine bonds within the court, including by many accounts a close personal relationship with the young prince, who would become Sultan Mehmed II. Radu, in short, went native. Vlad, on the other hand, curdled. Where Radu bent, Vlad hardened. He learned everything the Ottomans could teach him, absorbed their military brilliance and their psychological tactics like a sponge, and then quietly, privately, turned all of it into fuel for a resentment that would burn for the rest of his life. He took their lessons and vowed to use them against them. If you want to know why Vlad later became so terrifyingly effective at fighting the Ottomans, part of the answer is simple. They taught him how. The sensory texture of those years must have been a peculiar mix of luxury and dread, silk and fear, sweet pastries and sleepless nights. You would sit at a fine table one moment and lie awake the next, wondering whether a messenger from Wallachia carrying bad news might come morning transform your comfortable confinement into something far darker. It is the kind of psychological pressure that shapes a person permanently. And many historians point to these hostage years as the crucible in which Vlad's famous cruelty was forged. When you spend your adolescence entirely at the mercy of others, when your very survival hinges on forces you cannot influence, you may emerge, determined never ever to be powerless again, and willing to do quite frightening things to guarantee it. And this is where the scholarly debate opens up in earnest, because historians still argue whether Vlad's later brutality was genuinely rooted in the trauma of these captive years, or whether that explanation is a tidy piece of modern, psychological storytelling that we have projected backward onto a man who was simply a product of an extraordinarily violent age. Did captivity break something in him, or was he always going to be exactly what he became? Hostage or not, we cannot climb inside his 15th century skull to find out, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is selling something. What we can say is that the experience left him with two enormous gifts and one enormous grudge. The gifts were an intimate, insider's knowledge of Ottoman strategy and a fluency in the enemy's language and thinking. The grudge was personal, and it never faded. There is one more thread to pull before we move on, and it concerns loss. While Vlad languished in gilded captivity, catastrophe struck back home. His father, that dragon of the tightrope, and his older brother Mirsha both met violent ends in the tangled Wallachian power struggles betrayed by the local nobility. Word of this would have reached Vlad in the Ottoman court, and you can imagine the cold fury that settled over him upon hearing it. The men who took away his freedom were ironically now the only ones with any interest in seeing him restored, purely because a loyal Vlad on the throne suited their purposes. So the Ottomans released their grip, handed the young man a small force and pointed him toward home. They thought they were unleashing an obedient client. They had no idea they were unleashing a storm that had spent years learning exactly how they fought. And so, with the enemy's education in his head and vengeance in his heart, teenage Vlad turned his horse north toward a throne soaked in his own family's blood, ready to seize it for the very first time. So there you are, a teenager on horseback with an Ottoman escort at your back, and a homeland in chaos ahead of you, riding toward a crown that your enemies have generously decided to lend you for their own reasons. If that sounds like a shaky foundation for a reign, congratulations, you have grasped the central problem of Vlad's entire first attempt at ruling, which was less a coronation and more a brief, nervous cameo appearance. The year was 1448, and the opportunity arose almost by accident, the way opportunities so often did in the swirling madness of Wallachian politics. The man who had been sitting on the throne, a rival prince, marched off to join a large Christian military campaign against the Ottomans, leaving his seat conveniently, temptingly empty. The Ottomans, never ones to waste a good vacancy, saw their chance to plant their freshly educated young client on the Wallachian throne. And so they backed Vlad, handed him some troops, and off he went to claim what he genuinely believed was his birthright. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening, clean and simple. Vlad III first took the throne of Wallachia in 1448, and his initial reign lasted only about 2 months. 2 months. Barely enough time to learn where the good wine was kept, let alone establish anything resembling stable governance. You can picture the arrival. A young man rides into the seat of power, surrounded by foreign soldiers trying to project an authority he does not yet truly possess. The great hall would have been cold and echoing, the local nobles watching him with hooded, calculating eyes, sizing up whether this Ottoman-backed boy was worth obeying or worth quietly plotting against. And the answer, in the minds of most of those nobles, was almost certainly the latter. These were the same treacherous power brokers, the boyars who had recently helped murder his father and brother. They were not about to swear undying loyalty to the returning son of a man they had betrayed. They simply watched and waited and calculated. Meanwhile, the sensory reality of ruling a place like 15th century Wallachia would have been a rude awakening after the silk and marble of the Ottoman court. Draughty halls, guttering candles, the constant smell of tallow and damp stone, and messengers arriving daily with news that ranged from bad to catastrophic. You would spend your days trying to figure out who actually held power in the countryside, which nobles controlled which fortresses, and whose smiling face concealed a knife meant for your back. It was governance by paranoia, and honestly, given his family history, the paranoia was entirely justified. If your relatives had been assassinated by the same crowd now bowing politely in your throne room, you too might develop a lasting suspicion of anyone who complimented your outfit. The trouble, of course, was that Vlad's grip depended entirely on Ottoman support, and Ottoman support was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot the moment the wider political situation shifted. That large Christian campaign, the one that had drawn the previous prince away, ended in a crushing defeat for the Christian forces at a place called Kosovo. The defeated commander, a formidable Hungarian general named John Hunyadi, whose name you should also tuck away, because he is going to keep reappearing like an uninvited relative at holidays, promptly turned his attention back toward Wallachia, and the rival Prince Vlad had displaced came marching home with backing of his own, eager to reclaim the seat that the teenage upstart had borrowed. Vlad being neither foolish nor suicidal, read the room. With his flimsy Ottoman-provided force hopelessly outmatched and his local support essentially non-existent, he did the sensible thing that history rarely praises, but frequently rewards with a longer lifespan. He fled. After roughly 2 months of nominal rule, he abandoned the throne and slipped away into exile before anyone could arrange his impalement. An irony that will not be lost on you later. His very first reign ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with a strategic and rather humbling retreat. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for tonight, and it says something rather poignant about the man's situation. During this period of exile and instability, Vlad performed one of the most audacious political pivots imaginable. Having been installed by the Ottomans, he now sought refuge and support from the very Christian side that his Ottoman backers opposed, eventually attaching himself to the household of John Hunyadi, the same general whose forces had just been fighting the Ottomans, the same man who had been an enemy of Vlad's father. It was a breathtaking act of pragmatic reinvention. Vlad essentially switched teams, betting that his future lay not with the enemies who had raised him, but with the Christian powers, who might one day help him take the throne back on firmer footing. Whether this reveals a slippery opportunist or a clear-eyed survivor doing whatever it took, well, that depends on how charitable you are feeling at this hour. And naturally, historians still argue whether this first 2-month reign should even count as a proper reign at all, or whether it was merely a fleeting Ottoman experiment, a trial balloon so brief and so dependent on foreign bayonets, that it barely deserves a footnote. Some chroniclers of the era did not even bother to record it in detail, which is why the precise events remain frustratingly hazy. What is not hazy is the lesson young Vlad absorbed from the whole embarrassing episode. Power handed to you by others can be snatched back by others just as easily. A throne you cannot hold on your own is not really yours. If he wanted to rule Wallachia, truly rule it, he would need to build his own base of support, cultivate his own alliances, and above all, crush the treacherous nobility who kept treating the throne like a game of musical chairs played with human lives. So the teenage prince rode away from his lost crown, not defeated exactly, but educated once again, this time by failure. He carried with him the humiliation of that hasty flight and a growing hardening resolve. He would come back. It might take years of patient scheming, of shifting allegiances, of biding his time in foreign courts, but he would return. And when he did, he intended to make absolutely certain that no one would ever chase him off his throne so easily again. The long road back was beginning, and it would test his patience far more than any battlefield ever could. The years that followed were not the stuff of dramatic ballads. They were the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of a man rebuilding himself from the ground up. And if you have ever spent a long stretch waiting for a chance that refuses to arrive on schedule, you already understand the peculiar torment of distate. Vlad's wilderness years. This was the patient chapter. The one no vampire movie ever bothers to film, and yet it is arguably where the real Vlad was forged more thoroughly than in any dungeon or battlefield. After fleeing his 2-month throne, Vlad wandered. He spent time in exile in various places, including a stretch in Moldavia, the neighboring principality to the northeast, where a branch of his extended family held power. Here is your mainstream historical fact for tonight. During his years of exile, Vlad found refuge in Moldavia at the court of his relatives, and it was there. Most historians believe that he formed a lasting bond with his cousin Stephen, a young man who would grow up to become Stephen III of Moldavia, better known to posterity as Stephen the Great. The two young exiles, both dispossessed, both dreaming of thrones, both nursing grudges against the powers that had wronged their families, became close allies during these formative years. It is a genuinely touching detail, two future warlords bonding over their shared misfortune, plotting their comebacks by candlelight, probably complaining bitterly about their treacherous nobles the way you might complain about a difficult co-worker. But friendship in that world was a fragile, conditional thing, and the sensory reality of exile was far from cozy. Picture the endless travelling, the borrowed rooms in other men's castles, the humiliating dependence on the generosity of hosts who could withdraw their hospitality the moment it became politically inconvenient. You would wake each morning not entirely sure whose goodwill you were relying on that week. The food would be someone else's food, the roof someone else's roof, the future entirely unwritten and largely out of your hands. For a young man raised to believe he was born to rule this state of perpetual guesthood, must have chafed like an ill-fitting boot on a long march. And yet Vlad endured it, watched, learned, and waited, because he understood something crucial that his younger self had not. Timing was everything. Then came the great pivot, the one that would define the rest of his life. In a stunning display of political flexibility that would make a modern spin doctor weep with admiration, Vlad reconciled with John Hunyadi, the powerful Hungarian regent, the very man whose forces had opposed his father, the man on the Christian side of the great struggle against the Ottomans, who had once been Vlad's enemy by association. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening. Vlad, who had been placed on the throne by the Ottomans, now became a trusted lieutenant of the leading Christian warlord fighting against those same Ottomans, essentially completing a full political circle. Hunyadi came to see Vlad not as the son of an unreliable rival, but as a useful, capable young man who knew the Ottomans intimately, spoke their language, understood their tactics, and burned with a personal desire to fight them. In the cold arithmetic of realpolitik, Vlad's insider knowledge made him extraordinarily valuable. An enemy who has studied inside your enemy's house is worth a great deal. Under Hunyadi's patronage, Vlad learned the ways of the Hungarian court and its military, and crucially positioned himself as the natural Christian-backed candidate for the Wallachian throne. He was in effect being groomed as a border guardian, a man who could be installed in Wallachia to serve as a bulwark against Ottoman expansion. It was a far more solid foundation than the flimsy Ottoman sponsorship of his first attempt. This time, if he took the throne, he would have serious backing from the north, and he would take it as a defender of the Christian frontier rather than as a puppet of the empire to the south. The irony, given his upbringing, was thick enough to spread on toast. But Vlad was never a man to let irony stand in the way of ambition. The great turning point arrived in 1456, and it arrived as these things often do, wrapped in tragedy and opportunity in equal measure. That year, the Ottomans launched a massive assault on the fortress of Belgrade, a critical stronghold. John Hunyadi led a heroic defense and won a stunning victory that echoed across Christendom, but in the aftermath of the battle, a plague swept through the camps, and Hunyadi himself succumbed to it, dying just as his greatest triumph was being celebrated. The death of his patron might have seemed like a disaster for Vlad, but in the chaos and reshuffling that followed, the young exile finally saw his moment. With Christian backing and a force at his command, and with the Wallachian throne once again in a state of contested flux, Vlad made his move. In 1456 he seized the throne of Wallachia for the second time, and this time he intended to keep it. Historians still argue whether Vlad's long apprenticeship in exile, all those years of watching, waiting, and switching sides, reveals a coldly calculating strategic genius playing a long game with remarkable discipline, or simply a desperate man clutching at whatever raft floated past in a churning sea of shifting alliances. Was this patient mastery or lucky survival? Perhaps the honest answer is that in an age where most dispossessed princes simply vanished into obscurity, or an early grave merely surviving long enough to try again, was itself a kind of genius, or at least a kind of ferocious stubbornness, that looks a great deal like it. Whatever we call it, the wilderness years were over. The teenager who had fled his throne in humiliation returned as a hardened man in his mid-20s, backed by the Christian North, allied with his cousin in Moldavia, and carrying a lifetime of accumulated grievances against everyone who had ever wronged his family. He rode back into Wallachia not as a borrowed prince this time, but as a returning force of reckoning. And the first thing on his agenda, the very first item on a to-do list, written in something considerably darker than ink, was to settle accounts with the treacherous nobles who had murdered his father and brother and made his early life a misery. The reckoning was coming, and the boyars of Wallachia had no idea what was about to descend upon their comfortable feast. Now we arrive at the moment that transformed Vlad from a returning exile into a legend of terror, and I want you to keep in mind as we walk through it that everything here is filtered through chroniclers who were not exactly neutral observers. Hold that thought loosely because it will matter enormously later. For now, though, let us step into the great hall on the day the reckoning began, and try not to lose your appetite. The nobility of Wallachia, the boyars, were the true power in the land far more than any prince. They were the wealthy land-owning families who controlled the fortresses, commanded the local troops, and most importantly decided which princes lived and which princes died. Remember, these were the very people who had conspired in the deaths of Vlad's father and older brother. And the manner of his brother Mircea's death, according to the accounts that survive, was especially horrifying. Here is your mainstream historical fact, and it is a grim one. It was widely reported that Vlad's older brother Mircea was captured by political enemies in the city of Targovist, tortured, blinded, and buried alive. Vlad returned home carrying not just political ambition but a raw, personal grief and a thirst for vengeance that had been curing for years, like something left too long in the dark. So picture the scene that the chroniclers describe. Vlad, newly restored to the throne, invited the boyars and their families to a grand feast, a lavish celebration, ostensibly to mark his return and to make peace, to let bygones be bygones. The great hall would have glittered with candlelight, reflecting off silver the tables, groaning with roasted meats and rich wines, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and spiced food, and the nervous, performative cheer of powerful people pretending to trust one another. The boyars arrived in their finest clothing, no doubt calculating how to manipulate this young prince the way they had manipulated so many before him. They had watched princes come and go. They assumed Vlad would be just another chair in the endless game of musical thrones. It was, as it turned out, a catastrophic miscalculation. According to the traditional accounts, at some point during or after the feast, Vlad dropped the mask. He is said to have confronted the assembled nobles, demanding to know how many princes they had helped overthrow or murder over the years. The answer apparently was a great many, and Vlad, having heard enough, took his revenge. The older, guiltiest boyars, the ones most directly implicated in his family's destruction, met a swift and brutal end, impaled or otherwise executed. The younger and more able-bodied among them were, according to the stories, stripped of their fine clothing and marched off in chains to labour on the construction of a fortress high in the mountains, a place that would come to be, associated with Vlad's name, sometimes called Poenari Castle. They were worked, the accounts say, until their expensive garments rotted off their backs and they collapsed from exhaustion. It was a punishment designed to humiliate as much as to destroy, to strip away the very status and comfort that had made these men so arrogant and so dangerous. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening, and it is a strategic point that often gets lost beneath the horror. Vlad's purge of the old nobility was not merely an act of blind revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it. It was also a shrewd, if monstrous, political calculation. By destroying the entrenched boyar families who had made Wallachia ungovernable, who had toppled prince after prince, Vlad cleared the board. In their place, he elevated new men, lesser nobles, and loyal followers who owed their entire position and prosperity to him and him alone. He built a fresh power structure of people bound to his fortunes rather than to their own ancient bloodlines. In one grim stroke, he transformed himself from a puppet at the mercy of the aristocracy into a ruler with genuine, terrifying independence. Whether you find that admirably decisive or utterly appalling probably depends on whether you would rather live in a stable tyranny or a chaotic free-for-all. And reasonable people have disagreed about that for as long as there have been thrones to fight over. The mountain fortress those enslaved boyars were forced to build deserves a moment of its own because it survives to this day, perched on a crag in the Carpathian Mountains, reachable only by climbing many hundreds of steep stone steps. If you ever visit, and plenty of intrepid tourists do, you will find yourself gasping for breath as you ascend. And you might spare a thought for the aristocrats who reportedly hauled the very stones up that slope with their bare, blistered hands. It is a rather different building from the ornate Bran castle that the tourism industry likes to market as Dracula's castle, which, in a delicious historical irony, Vlad probably had little or nothing to do with. But that is a knot we will untangle another night. And of course, historians still argue whether this dramatic feast and purge actually happened as described as a single theatrical event, or whether it is a compressed, embellished folk memory that stitched together several separate acts of violence into one memorable story. The sources are late, often hostile, and clearly relished a good gruesome tale. Some scholars suspect the feast massacre grew in the telling, becoming more cinematic and more complete, with each retelling the way stories do when they pass from mouth to mouth around firesides. What seems undeniable is that Vlad did move decisively and violently against the old nobility early in his reign, and that this brutality became the foundation of his rule. The details may be dramatized, but the underlying reality, a young prince crushing the aristocracy that had destroyed his family, is broadly accepted. Whatever the precise truth, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. Word of what happened to the boyars spread through the land like a cold wind. People understood suddenly and completely that this prince was unlike the pliable rulers who had come before. This one did not negotiate with treachery. This one answered it with stakes. And in that dawning realization, across every village and market town and noble estate in Wallachia, something remarkable began to take hold. It was fear, yes, but it was also strangely a kind of order, because a man this ruthless, this willing to punish, could enforce laws that no previous prince had ever managed to enforce. And Vlad was about to turn that fear into the most effective governing tool his tortured little country had ever seen. Here is a genuinely unsettling idea to consider as you lie there in the safety of your warm bed. Terror applied consistently and without exception can produce something that looks remarkably like peace. Not a kind peace, not a gentle one, but a functional order in which the roads are safe, the merchants are honest, and the criminals are well elsewhere. This was the strange and terrible engine at the heart of Vlad's reign, and understanding it is the key to understanding why so many Romanians remember him as a hero rather than a horror. When Vlad took firm control of Wallachia, he inherited a land riddled with lawlessness. Bandits preyed on travelers, corrupt officials skimmed and cheated, thieves operated with near impunity because the previous weak princes had lacked the authority to stop them. Into this chaos strode a ruler with an absolutely uncompromising, some would say pathological obsession with order and honesty. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. Vlad enforced his laws with such extreme and consistent severity that, according to numerous contemporary accounts, crime in Wallachia dropped dramatically during his reign, and the roads became notably safe for honest travelers and merchants. His method was brutally simple. Break the law, and you would be impaled regardless of your rank, your wealth, or your excuses. There were no special exemptions for the powerful, which oddly enough made him something close to an equal opportunity terror. The rich thief and the poor thief could expect precisely the same grim fate, and in a medieval world, where justice usually bent toward whoever had the most money, that ruthless consistency was genuinely revolutionary. The sensory landscape of Vlad's Wallachia must have been extraordinary in its contradictions. Picture a marketplace where merchants left their stalls unattended without a flicker of worry, because the thought of theft was simply unthinkable. Picture roads where a traveler could walk for days with a purse of gold and never once glance nervously over their shoulder. And then picture, at the edges of towns and along the approaches to cities, the stark, silent reminders of what enforced this remarkable order. The grim silhouettes that gave the prince his enduring name. It was a society held together by a single, unwavering promise. Obey and you are safer here than anywhere in Europe. Disobey and you will become a warning to others. The comfort and the horror were two sides of the same coin, forever inseparable. Now here is your quirky fringe tidbit, and it reveals just how deep Vlad's obsession with order truly ran. His fury extended not only to thieves and murderers, but to the idle, the dishonest, and even, according to some accounts, the sick and the poor who he felt were burdens rather than contributors. There is a chilling story which we will treat with appropriate skepticism, that Vlad once invited the beggars, the ill and the destitute of his realm to a great feast, fed them lavishly, asked them whether they would like to be free of all worldly cares forever, and then, upon their bewildered agreement, had the hall sealed and burned. Whether this actually happened or is a piece of dark propaganda, and I lean heavily toward the latter, it illustrates the reputation Vlad had for viewing his kingdom as a machine that should contain no waste, no weakness, and no dishonesty. He wanted a realm as disciplined as the Ottoman army he had studied in captivity, and he was willing to be as pitiless as necessary to get it. It is not a comfortable philosophy, and you would not want him running your neighborhood watch, but you cannot deny it produced results of a certain grim kind. What makes Vlad genuinely fascinating rather than merely monstrous is that his cruelty was not random or chaotic. It was systematic, purposeful, and directed toward clear political ends. Every impaling served a function, whether punishing crime, eliminating rivals, or projecting an image of unshakable authority. He understood, perhaps better than almost any ruler of his age, the psychology of power. He grasped that a reputation for absolute, inescapable severity could accomplish what armies could not. If people believed you would always follow through, always punish, never waver, then most of them would simply never test you. The threat did the work. This is precisely why some modern thinkers, when they study Vlad, see not a lunatic but a coldly rational practitioner of what we might now call deterrence, a man who weaponized fear itself with almost scientific precision. And this brings us naturally to the great debate, because historians still argue whether Vlad's brutality was primarily the tool of a genuine state builder trying to save a failing country through the only means available in a savage age, or whether it was the self-indulgent cruelty of a sadist who simply dressed up his personal bloodlust in the respectable clothing of law and order. Was he a harsh but effective reformer, or a monster who happened to be organized about it? The uncomfortable truth is that these two interpretations are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A person can be both genuinely committed to order and genuinely enjoy inflicting suffering and untangling motive from a distance of over 500 years, using sources written by people with obvious agendas. May simply be impossible. You are free to make up your own mind, and I suspect your verdict may shift more than once before our night is through. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we move on. The order Vlad created was real, but it was also fragile in a way that pure terror always is. It depended entirely on him, on his presence, his will, his willingness to keep enforcing the unenforceable standard. A kingdom held together by fear of one man is only ever as stable as that man's grip on power. The moment Vlad was gone, or weakened or distracted by larger threats, the whole terrible clockwork could unwind. And larger threats were coming, because you cannot spend your life defying the most powerful empire on your doorstep without eventually attracting its full and furious attention. But before we get to the clash of armies, let me tell you one particular legend that captures the essence of Vlad's fear-built kingdom better than any dry description ever could. It is the story of a golden cup left alone in a public square and what its untouched presence revealed about the strange and terrible peace of Vlad's Wallachia. Some stories survive the centuries not because they are certainly true, but because they capture something essential in a single perfect image. And the legend I am about to tell you is exactly that kind of story. It is small, almost quaint compared to the darker tales, and yet it distills the entire strange logic of Vlad's kingdom into one glittering object sitting undisturbed in the sunlight. So let us walk together into a town square in 15th century Wallachia and consider the cup. The story goes like this. In a public square, most often placed in the town of Targovist in the retellings near a fountain or a well, where travellers and townsfolk would come to drink, Vlad ordered that a magnificent drinking cup be left out in the open. And this was no humble wooden mug. The accounts describe it as a cup of extraordinary value, made of gold or richly gilded, sometimes studded with jewels gleaming and beautiful and utterly temptingly unguarded. Anyone who was thirsty could use it to drink from the public water source. It sat there day after day, worth more than most peasants would see in a lifetime, entirely unprotected, guarded by nothing but the reputation of the prince who had placed it there. Here is your mainstream historical fact, or at least the mainstream version of the legend as it comes down to us. According to the accounts, the golden cup remained in the square untouched and unstolen for the entire duration of Vlad's reign. Nobody took it. Nobody so much as chipped a jewel from its rim. In a land that had recently been overrun with thieves and bandits, an object of immense value sat completely exposed and yet completely safe, purely because the population understood with absolute clarity what would happen to anyone foolish enough to pocket it. The cup was not protected by locks or guards. It was protected by fear, the same invisible force that kept the roads safe and the marketplaces honest. It was, in a sense, a public demonstration, a piece of theatre, a way for Vlad to say to his people, and to any visiting foreigner, "Look how disciplined my realm has become. Look how completely my law is obeyed." Picture the scene as you drift there in your imagination. The square is dusty and sun-warmed, the fountain trickling gently, market sellers calling out their wares, children darting between the stalls. And there, catching the light, sits the cup, radiant and forbidden. A thirsty traveller approaches, lifts it, drinks, and sets it carefully back down, taking exquisite care not to walk off with it, not even to linger too long in a way that might look suspicious. You can almost feel the collective unspoken agreement that hums through the square. We do not touch the cup. We drink and we return it, and we do not tempt the prince. There is something almost hypnotic about the discipline of it, a whole population moving in perfect, fearful harmony around a single shining object. Now, here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening, and it complicates the pretty picture rather delightfully. The Golden Cup legend is not unique to Vlad at all. Very similar stories of a valuable object left unguarded to demonstrate the perfect justice or perfect order of a ruler appear in the folklore and histories of many different cultures and eras, attached to all sorts of famous kings and lawgivers across the ancient and medieval world. It is what scholars call a wandering legend, a portable anecdote that attaches itself to whichever powerful figure the storyteller wishes to illustrate. This does not necessarily mean it never happened in Vlad's case, but it does suggest we should hold the tale a little more loosely than we might a documented battle. The story may have been borrowed and draped over Vlad precisely because it fit his reputation so neatly, the way a well-tailored coat seems made for whoever happens to be wearing it. In that sense, the cup tells us less about what Vlad actually did and more about how completely people believed in the terrifying order he had created. And that belief is the truly important thing, because a reputation for perfect enforcement is almost as powerful as perfect enforcement itself. If everyone is convinced that theft means certain gruesome death, then hardly anyone will steal, and the ruler barely needs to lift a finger to maintain order. The cup becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, a monument to a fear so total that it does the governing all on its own. Vlad, whether or not he ever actually set out a golden cup, clearly understood this principle down to his bones. He knew that the image of his justice could be as useful as the reality that a well-placed symbol could reinforce his authority across the whole realm without a single additional act of violence. In an age long before mass communication, a legendary golden cup was a remarkably efficient piece of statecraft. Naturally, historians still argue whether the Golden Cup story reflects any real event from Vlad's reign at all, or whether it is entirely a piece of migratory folklore that latched onto his fearsome name, embellishing a reputation that hardly needed the help. Some point out that the story appears in sources known for their moralizing tendencies. Sources more interested in illustrating a point than in recording literal fact. Others argue that even if the specific cup is invented, it accurately captures a documented reality, namely that Vlad's Wallachia really did become remarkably orderly and safe under his iron rule. The disagreement, as so often with Vlad, is less about whether he was capable of inspiring such fear, which is beyond dispute, and more about which specific colourful anecdotes we can actually trust. Either way, the Golden Cup remains one of the most telling images in the entire Vlad legend, a small, bright symbol of the enormous dark bargain at the centre of his kingdom. Order for terror, safety for fear, a gleaming treasure left untouched because the alternative was unthinkable. It is a story that lets you feel the strange atmosphere of his realm without any of the grislier details, and I rather appreciate it for that mercy. But this hard-won, fear-forged order was about to be tested by something far larger than any local thief. Down in the south, the mighty Ottoman Empire, the very power that had raised Vlad in captivity, was watching Wallachia with growing displeasure. And soon they would send their emissaries north, with demands that Vlad had absolutely no intention of meeting. Every act of defiance has a precise moment when it becomes irreversible, a single point at which a man decides he would rather face annihilation than submit. And for Vlad, that moment arrived when Ottoman envoys came to his court with usual demands, and left in a condition that made further negotiation somewhat difficult. We are approaching one of the most famous confrontations in his entire story, so let us set the stage carefully because the details matter. For years, Wallachia had existed in an uneasy vassalage to the Ottoman Empire, and the price of relative peace was tribute. Here is your mainstream historical fact for tonight. Wallachia was expected to pay an annual tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, a substantial sum of money, and even more painfully, a levy of young boys who would be taken from their families and absorbed into the Ottoman system, some destined to become part of the elite slave soldier corps known as the Janissaries. This was the humiliating arrangement that Vlad's own father had accepted, the same bargain that had sent Vlad himself into captivity as a boy. Paying it meant acknowledging Ottoman overlordship, bowing to the empire to the south, and quite literally handing over the children of your realm to serve your master. For a proud, vengeful man who had spent his formative years as a hostage of that very empire, the tribute was not merely a financial burden, it was a personal burning insult, a yearly reminder of everything that had been taken from him. By the early 1460s, Vlad had decided he was done paying. He had spent years consolidating his power, crushing his internal enemies, and building a realm disciplined enough to fight. Now, with his position secure at home, and with the possibility of Christian support from the north, he made the fateful decision to defy the Sultan directly. When Ottoman envoys arrived at his court to collect the overdue tribute, Vlad refused. And here the sources give us one of the most vivid and often repeated anecdotes in the whole Dracula legend, so let me tell it, with the usual caveat that its literal truth is debated. According to the story, when the Ottoman envoys stood before Vlad, they kept their turbans on their heads in his presence, explaining that it was their custom never to remove them, a custom rooted in their faith. Vlad, in a display of grim, sardonic wit, is said to have replied that he wished to strengthen and honour their custom, to make sure they would never have to remove their turbans again. He then had the turbans nailed firmly to their heads, ensuring that they could indeed keep them on permanently. It is a shocking, blackly comic image, and it captures Vlad's particular flavour of cruelty perfectly, that streak of theatrical, almost witty savagery that made his violence feel personal and pointed rather than merely functional. The message to the Sultan could not have been clearer. Vlad was not just refusing the tribute. He was mocking Ottoman authority, spitting in the eye of the most powerful empire in the region, and daring them to respond. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening. That grimly memorable turban story, like several of Vlad's most famous anecdotes, appears prominently in the German-language pamphlets that circulated after his fall, sources that were often deliberately trying to paint him as a bloodthirsty monster for political reasons. The very same story, or versions extremely close to it, has also been attached to other rulers in other tellings, which should make us at least mildly suspicious. And yet the core historical event beneath the legend, Vlad's decisive refusal to pay the Ottoman tribute and his choice to provoke open war rather than submit, is entirely genuine and well documented. So even if the nailed turbans are embellishment, the underlying defiance was absolutely real. Vlad genuinely gambled his tiny principality against the might of the Ottoman Empire, which was, depending on your perspective, either magnificently brave or breathtakingly reckless, and possibly both at once. The consequences of this defiance escalated quickly and dramatically. The Sultan, the same Mehmed II who had conquered Constantinople and ended the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire, one of the most formidable rulers of the entire 15th century, did not take kindly to being mocked by the prince of a small vassal state. He attempted, according to the accounts, to lure Vlad into a trap, dispatching an official along with a military commander to seize him under the pretense of diplomacy. But Vlad, sharpened by his years in the Ottoman court and fluent in exactly this kind of treachery, saw through the scheme. He turned the trap around, captured the would-be captors, and dealt with them in his signature fashion. There would be no more pretense of peace. The gauntlet had been thrown down on both sides. What followed was a bold military campaign, in which Vlad launched raids across the Danube River into Ottoman-held territory, striking hard and fast against the empire's forces and settlements. Along the frontier, during the winter, he inflicted significant casualties and caused real damage, sending shockwaves through the region and announcing to all of Christendom that here at last was a leader willing to take the fight directly to the seemingly invincible Ottomans. For a brief, glorious moment, Vlad became a hero of Christian Europe, a defender of the frontier, the man who dared to strike back. Reports of his raids were celebrated in the courts of the north. And of course, historians still argue whether Vlad's defiance was a shrewd, calculated bet made in the genuine expectation that Christian allies would rally to support his stand against the Ottomans, or a doomed act of prideful defiance by a man whose personal hatred of the empire overrode his strategic judgment. Did he truly believe he could win, or was he simply unable to stomach submission any longer? Consequences be damned. The answer probably lies tangled somewhere in the knot of politics, personality, and unhealed childhood wounds that made Vlad who he was. What is certain is that he had now committed himself irrevocably. He had defied the Sultan, humiliated his envoys, and drawn Ottoman blood along the Danube. There was no walking this back, no return to the comfortable, humiliating peace of tribute. Mehmed II, furious and determined to make an example of his impudent former hostage, began assembling one of the largest armies the region had ever seen, a vast host marching north to crush Wallachia and its defiant prince once and for all. And Vlad, with his tiny force, prepared to meet an empire. There is a particular kind of courage that shades into something almost like madness, the courage of a man who, facing an army many times the size of his own, decides that the only sensible response is to sneak into the enemy camp in the dead of night and try to personally decapitate the empire. This is the story of that night, one of the most audacious military operations of the entire medieval period, and it is the moment when Vlad the Impaler transcended mere brutality and revealed himself as a genuine tactical genius. So let us ride out with him under cover of darkness and try to feel the terror and the thrill of it. First, the scale of what Vlad was facing. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. In the summer of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II personally led an enormous army into Wallachia to punish Vlad, a force that contemporary sources numbered in the tens of thousands and that some accounts inflated to well over 100,000 men, making it one of the largest Ottoman campaigns since the conquest of Constantinople itself. Against this overwhelming host, Vlad could muster perhaps a tenth of the numbers, a small mobile force that stood no chance in a straightforward pitched battle. He knew this perfectly well. And so, rather than meet the empire head-on, in the kind of open confrontation that would have annihilated his army in an afternoon, Vlad turned to the tactics of a man who had studied the Ottomans from the inside, the tactics of harassment, denial, and psychological warfare. As Mehmed's massive army advanced into Wallachia, they found not a kingdom to conquer but a wasteland deliberately prepared for their misery. Vlad employed what we would now call a scorched earth strategy. He burned the crops, poisoned the wells, drove off the livestock, and diverted rivers to create swamps and marshes across the army's path. The Ottoman soldiers, marching through the brutal summer heat, found no food to forage, no clean water to drink, and no shelter to rest in. Disease began to spread through the ranks. The great army, so formidable on paper, started to weaken and suffer before it had even fought a proper battle. Vlad understood that an army of that size was a hungry, thirsty beast, and that if he could deny it sustenance, the land itself would become his most powerful weapon. It was warfare by attrition, by patience, by the deliberate creation of hardship, and it was working. But Vlad was not content merely to starve his enemy. He wanted to strike a blow that would shatter Ottoman morale and, if fortune favoured him, end the campaign in a single stroke. And so he conceived one of the most daring operations imaginable. On a night in June of 1462, Vlad led a picked force of his men in a surprise raid directly into the heart of the sleeping Ottoman camp. This is what history remembers as the night attack. Under the cover of darkness, exploiting his intimate knowledge of the Ottoman language, customs, and military organization, Vlad and his men infiltrated the vast encampment with one overriding objective. They were hunting the Sultan himself. If they could find Mehmed's tent and kill him, the entire invasion would collapse. The enormous army rendered leaderless and purposeless in an instant. Picture the chaos of that night. The camp is a sprawling city of tents stretching across the dark plain. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, asleep campfires guttering, low sentries dozing at their posts. And then, without warning, Vlad's raiders burst into the darkness, striking with torches and blades, sowing panic and confusion. In the black bewilderment of a night attack, the sleeping soldiers could not tell friend from foe, could not organize a coherent defense, could only stumble in terror as death moved among them. Vlad's men cut a path of chaos through the camp, searching desperately for the Sultan's tent. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit, and it is the cruel twist of the whole endeavor. According to the accounts, Vlad's raiders did reach a magnificent tent and fell upon it with fury, only to discover that they had attacked the wrong tent. In the darkness and confusion, they had struck the pavilions of two of the Sultan's high-ranking officials rather than that of Mehmed himself. The Sultan survived, and the single decisive blow Vlad had gambled everything on slipped through his fingers by the cruelest of margins. Despite failing to kill Mehmed, the night attack inflicted heavy casualties and, more importantly, delivered a profound psychological shock to the Ottoman host. The idea that this defiant prince could strike into the very center of their camp, could come within tents of the Sultan himself, unnerved the great army badly. It demonstrated that no one, not even Mehmed, was truly safe, and it lent Vlad an aura of almost supernatural audacity. The raid did not win the war, but it announced in the most dramatic terms possible that Wallachia would not be conquered easily, that its prince was a wolf who would come for your throat in the night. And so historians still argue whether the night attack should be counted a failure, since Vlad did not achieve his primary goal of killing the Sultan and thereby ending the invasion, or a remarkable success since it inflicted real damage and struck a psychological blow that reverberated through the campaign and cemented Vlad's fearsome reputation for generations. Some military historians regard it as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a textbook example of how a smaller force can use surprise terrain and audacity to punch far above its weight against an overwhelming enemy. Others note more soberly that audacity alone could not overcome the sheer arithmetic of the Ottoman advantage, and that the raid, however brilliant, ultimately changed the campaign's outcome very little. As always with Vlad, the interpretation depends on where you choose to stand. What is beyond dispute is the sheer nerve of it. A prince outnumbered many times over, refusing to cower, choosing instead to hunt the most powerful ruler in the region through his own darkened camp, is the kind of story that ensures a man is never forgotten. Yet the Sultan lived, and his army, though shaken, was still enormous, still advancing, still determined to reach Vlad's capital and bring the defiant prince to heel. Mehmed pressed onward toward Targovist, expecting perhaps to find a fortress to besiege or a battle to fight. Instead, on the road ahead, waiting silently in the summer haze, was a sight so appalling that it would test the resolve of even the most hardened Ottoman veteran. A sight that would enter legend as the moment Vlad's terror finally reached its full and dreadful flowering. Some sights cannot be unseen, and there is a moment in Vlad's story so infamous that it has echoed down 5 centuries as the ultimate expression of psychological warfare. The point at which terror stopped being a governing tool and friend's culmination became a weapon of war aimed directly at the will of an Ofro invading empire. We approach it now with as much delicacy as the subject allows, because this is a bedtime story, and I have no wish to send you into troubled dreams, but we cannot understand Vlad without understanding this. So walk with me up the road toward Targovist in the summer heat, and consider what the Ottoman army found waiting for them. After the chaos of the night attack, Sultan Mehmed pressed his weary, disease-thinned army onward toward the Wallachian capital, expecting to corner Vlad and force a decisive confrontation. The march had already been miserable through poisoned, burned, and empty land, the soldiers exhausted and demoralized. And then, as they neared the capital, the scouts came upon something on the plain outside the city that stopped the entire army in its tracks. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening, delivered as gently as such a thing can be. According to multiple contemporary sources, including the account of a Byzantine chronicler and the reports that filtered back to European courts, the Ottoman army encountered a vast field in which the bodies of thousands of captured Ottoman soldiers and Turkish prisoners had been impaled upon stakes arranged across a great expanse of ground in a deliberate, horrifying display. This grim tableau is what history remembers as the Forest of the Impaled. The scale described in the accounts is staggering, with the numbers running into the thousands, and the site was engineered for maximum psychological impact. Imagine the Ottoman soldiers cresting a rise, expecting perhaps to see the enemy's fortifications, and instead beholding this endless field of death stretching before them. A silent army of the fallen arranged with terrible methodical care. The smell alone carried on, the summer wind would have been overwhelming. The message was unmistakable and directed at every single soldier in that host. This is what your prince will not save you from. This is what awaits you if you continue. Turn back. And here is the truly remarkable part, the detail that elevates this from mere atrocity to a genuine, if monstrous, act of strategic brilliance. The Sultan himself, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, one of the most powerful and battle-hardened rulers of the age, is said to have been so shaken and disturbed by the sight that he lost his appetite for the campaign. According to the accounts, Mehmed reportedly remarked that he could not hope to take the land from a man capable of such deeds, a man who treated his own subjects and enemies with such extremity. In one of the most extraordinary reversals in military history, the enormous Ottoman army, having marched all the way into Wallachia to crush a single defiant prince, essentially turned around and withdrew, at least in part, the sources suggest, because of the sheer psychological devastation of what they had witnessed. Vlad had won a strategic victory not with swords but with pure, calculated horror. He had made himself so terrifying that even an emperor decided the prize was not worth the price. Now here is your quirky fringe tidbit, and it adds a layer of grim rationality to what seems like pure savagery. Many of those impaled, according to the accounts, were Ottoman prisoners of war and captured soldiers, but the display also reportedly included the bodies of those from an earlier Ottoman raiding party and various enemies Vlad had accumulated. What is fascinating is that some scholars interpret the Forest of the Impaled not as a spontaneous eruption of madness, but as a coldly deliberate piece of military theatre staged with the specific and rational goal of breaking Ottoman morale and deterring the advance. In this reading, Vlad was not a frenzied maniac, but a ruthless strategist who understood perhaps better than anyone of his era that war is fundamentally a contest of wills, and that a sufficiently horrifying spectacle could accomplish what his outnumbered army never could. It is a deeply uncomfortable idea that such an act could be described as effective, and yet the historical outcome lends it an awful credibility. The horror worked. The sensory and psychological reality for the Ottoman soldiers must have been beyond description. These were experienced fighters, men who had seen death many times, and yet even they were reportedly broken by the sight. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from the fear of an honest battle, but from the realization that your enemy operates entirely outside the bounds of anything you consider human, that he will do things you cannot imagine doing, and that no rules or restraints will protect you from. Vlad cultivated exactly this dread. He wanted the Ottomans to believe they were facing not a mortal opponent, but something closer to a force of nature or a demon, and in this he succeeded so completely that his reputation for cruelty became paradoxically one of his most powerful defensive weapons. And of course, historians still argue whether the numbers reported for the Forest of the Impaled, running into the tens of thousands in some of the more lurid accounts, are remotely accurate, or whether they are wild exaggerations produced by horrified chroniclers and hostile propagandists who had every reason to inflate the horror. The truth of the scale is probably impossible to recover. Some modern historians suspect the real figures, while still appalling, were considerably smaller than the legend claims, and that the story grew in the telling as it spread across a scandalized Europe. Others point out that even hostile sources and neutral observers broadly agree on the essential event, a mass impalement staged to terrify the Ottoman army, which suggests a genuine historical core beneath the embellishment. As with so much of Vlad's story, the skeleton is real even if the flesh has been dramatized. Whatever the precise numbers, the strategic result was undeniable. Mehmed withdrew the bulk of his forces from Wallachia, and Vlad, against all odds, had survived the full fury of the Ottoman Empire. For a moment he stood triumphant, the man who had defied the Sultan and lived the terror who had turned back an emperor. But triumph in Vlad's world was always fleeting, and the very reputation that had saved him was about to become the instrument of his undoing, because those horrifying tales, the impalings and the atrocities, were about to be captured, printed and spread across Europe by a brand new technology, and they would transform Vlad from a feared frontier defender into something else, entirely a monster for the ages, immortalized in ink. Here is a thought to unsettle you pleasantly as you lie there in the dark. The reason you know Vlad the Impaler's name today, the reason his reputation for monstrous cruelty has echoed across 5 full centuries, may have less to do with what he actually did and more to do with a machine. A clever arrangement of metal type and ink and paper that happened to be invented at precisely the right moment to turn one man into the world's first mass media villain. Vlad had the extraordinary misfortune, or perhaps the strange immortality, of becoming famous just as Europe learned to print. Let us set the scene. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. The printing press, developed by Johannes Gutenberg in the German lands around the middle of the 15th century, was spreading rapidly across Europe during exactly the years of Vlad's reign and downfall. For the first time in human history, information could be reproduced quickly and cheaply and distributed widely, no longer laboriously copied by hand in monasteries, but churned out in quantity for a growing reading public hungry for news, scandal and sensation. And among the earliest bestsellers of this new medium were pamphlets, short-printed booklets, and one particularly popular subject for these pamphlets was the shocking blood-curdling deeds of a certain Wallachian prince. Accounts of Vlad's atrocities, printed primarily in German, circulated widely across the German-speaking lands and beyond, with lurid titles and even more lurid woodcut illustrations, depicting the prince dining calmly amid a forest of impaled victims. These were, in a very real sense, among the first mass-produced horror stories, the medieval equivalent of a sensationalist tabloid, and they sold extraordinarily well. Now, why were these pamphlets produced, and who was producing them? This is where things get politically interesting, and it is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening. Many of the most damning accounts of Vlad's cruelty originated not from neutral observers but from his political enemies, particularly the Saxon merchant communities of Transylvania, with whom Vlad had bitter and violent conflicts over trade rights and privileges. Vlad had at various points cracked down hard on these German-speaking Saxon merchants, punishing them severely for what he saw as economic betrayal and defiance of his authority. Unsurprisingly, these merchants and their kinsmen back in the German lands were highly motivated to portray Vlad in the darkest possible light, and they had access to the presses to do exactly that. The pamphlets served a clear political purpose, painting Vlad as a bloodthirsty tyrant and monster, partly to justify opposition to him, and partly quite simply because sensational horror stories sold copies. In other words, a significant portion of Vlad's monstrous reputation was manufactured by people with a direct grudge against him, using a brand new technology perfectly suited to spreading vivid propaganda far and wide. Consider the implications of this for a moment, because they are genuinely profound. When you strip away the pamphlets, what remains of the Vlad legend is far harder to verify. The most gruesome and specific anecdotes, the dinner amid the Impaled, the elaborate tortures, the numbers running into the tens of thousands, tend to trace back to precisely these hostile German sources. This does not mean Vlad was innocent, far from it. Even sympathetic and neutral accounts confirm that he used impalement and that he was extraordinarily severe. But the sheer scale, the theatrical relish, the almost gleeful monstrousness of the printed portrait, all of this bears the fingerprints of enemies working with a powerful new propaganda tool. Vlad may have been the first ruler in history whose reputation was to a significant degree shaped by mass media, and the media in question was controlled largely by people who wanted him destroyed. The picture becomes even more fascinating when you compare these hostile German pamphlets with sources from other cultures. In the Russian and Slavic tradition, for instance, there circulated accounts of Vlad that, while still acknowledging his terrible severity, framed him quite differently, sometimes presenting his harshness as a form of stern, if extreme, justice. The fearsome discipline of a ruler determined to impose order and root out dishonesty. And in the Romanian oral and folk tradition, as we touched on at the very beginning of our night together, Vlad was often remembered as a heroic defender and a just, if harsh, prince. The same man, the same deeds refracted through 3 or 4 different cultural lenses, producing wildly different portraits. The German pamphlets gave us the monster. The Slavic accounts gave us the stern judge. The Romanian tradition gave us the hero. And the truth presumably lies somewhere in the shifting overlap of all of them, permanently obscured by the agendas of everyone who ever wrote his story down. This is why historians still argue about the reliability of nearly every dramatic anecdote in Vlad's biography, weighing the hostile bias of the German pamphlets against the more favorable Slavic and Romanian traditions, and trying to identify the sober kernel of truth buried beneath layers of propaganda and folk embellishment on all sides. It is a genuinely difficult scholarly puzzle, because we have very few truly neutral sources, and even those are fragmentary. Some historians argue that the German pamphlets, despite their obvious bias, must contain real information because their details are too specific and too consistent to be pure invention. Others counter that propaganda is often at its most effective precisely when it wraps a kernel of truth in a mountain of exaggeration. The debate is unlikely ever to be fully resolved, which is part of what makes Vlad such an endlessly fascinating figure to study. What is certain is that the printing press did for Vlad what no chronicle ever could. It made him famous across an entire continent, cemented his image as the ultimate cruel tyrant in the popular imagination, and ensured that his name and his signature horror would survive long after his death. Without the press, Vlad might have been merely one more forgotten regional warlord in the endless churn of medieval Balkan politics, remembered only in dusty local records. Instead, he became a legend, a byword for cruelty, a figure whose reputation would eventually, centuries later, catch the eye of a certain Irish novelist looking for a suitably sinister name for his vampire. But that transformation lay far in the future. For Vlad himself, the immediate consequence of his fame and his defiance was not immortality but betrayal, because even as European courts celebrated the man who had turned back, the Sultan, one supposed Christian ally, was preparing to clap him in chains and lock him away for many long years. The hero of Christendom was about to become a prisoner. There is a special bitterness reserved for betrayal by those who ought to be your allies, and Vlad, who had spent his whole life expecting treachery from every direction, still managed to be blindsided by it in the moment of his greatest triumph. having just turned back the might of the Ottoman Empire, having become the celebrated defender of the Christian frontier. He found himself not rewarded but arrested, not honored but imprisoned, and by the very Christian king who was supposed to be his greatest supporter. It is one of the cruelest ironies in a life absolutely stuffed with them. Let us trace how this happened. After the Ottoman withdrawal in 1462, Vlad's position, which had seemed so triumphant, was in fact dangerously precarious. Sultan Mehmed, though he had pulled back the bulk of his forces, had not simply given up. Remember Vlad's younger brother Radu, the handsome, pliable one who had gone native in the Ottoman court all those years ago. The Sultan now deployed him as a rival claimant to the Wallachian throne, backing Radu with Ottoman support and using him to peel away Vlad's exhausted and war-weary nobles. Radu, the handsome, charming and Ottoman-friendly, offered the Wallachian elite a far more comfortable arrangement than his fanatically defiant brother, and many of them, tired of endless war and terror, began to defect to Radu's side. Vlad's support crumbled beneath him, and he was forced to retreat northward toward the mountains and toward the kingdom of Hungary, seeking refuge and reinforcement from his Christian ally, King Matthias Corvinus, the son of that same John Hunyadi, who had once been Vlad's patron. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening, and it is a shocking one. When Vlad fled to Hungary seeking aid from King Matthias Corvinus, in late 1462, the king did not help him. Instead, Matthias had Vlad arrested and imprisoned, holding him in captivity in Hungary for many years, with most estimates placing the imprisonment at somewhere between roughly 12 and 14 years. The very man Vlad turned to for salvation locked him away instead. It was a devastating reversal of fortune, and it stemmed from a tangle of political motives that historians have picked apart ever since. The immediate justification Matthias offered was explosive. He claimed to possess letters supposedly written by Vlad, in which the Wallachian prince offered to betray the Christian cause and switch his allegiance back to the Ottoman Sultan. On the strength of these letters, Matthias declared Vlad a traitor and justified his imprisonment to the courts of Europe. And here is your quirky, fringe tidbit for the evening, because those letters are one of the great forgery mysteries of the 15th century. Many historians strongly suspect that the incriminating letters were fabricated, forged either by Matthias himself or by his agents, or possibly by Vlad's Saxon enemies, precisely to provide a convenient pretext for eliminating a prince who had become politically inconvenient. Why would Matthias want to imprison the hero who had just fought the Sultan? The likely answer is money and politics. Matthias had received substantial funds from the Pope and other Christian powers, specifically to fund a crusade against the Ottomans, a crusade that was supposed to support Vlad. But Matthias, it seems, preferred to keep the money for his own purposes and had little genuine appetite for a costly war. Imprisoning Vlad on trumped-up charges of treason gave him a tidy excuse to abandon the whole enterprise while appearing to act righteously. Vlad, in short, may have been sacrificed to cover a king's embezzlement, framed as a traitor to hide someone else's betrayal. Picture the fall of it. One moment, Vlad is the toast of Christian Europe, the fearless defender who made the Sultan blink. The next, he is a prisoner, his name blackened by forged letters, locked away in a foreign land, while his brother sits on his throne and his enemies celebrate. The sensory reality of imprisonment, after a life of ferocious action and command, must have been its own particular torment. The confinement, the inactivity, the helplessness, all of it inflicted on a man whose entire identity was built on control and dominance. We do not have detailed records of exactly how harsh his confinement was, and accounts vary considerably, which is itself part of the mystery, but the sheer duration of it, more than a decade of a man's prime years, spent behind walls, is a stark and sobering fact. There is a darkly comic legend about Vlad's time in captivity, and I share it with the usual grain of salt. According to some accounts, even in prison, Vlad could not shake his obsessive cruelty, and he was said to pass the time by capturing rats and small birds that found their way into his cell, and well subjecting them to miniature versions of his signature punishment. Whether this is true or simply another piece of colourful legend designed to reinforce his monstrous image, it paints a vivid, pitiable picture of a caged predator with nothing left to dominate but vermin. It is the kind of detail that makes you wonder about the psychology of a man defined so completely by the exercise of terrible power, suddenly stripped of every outlet for it. And so historians still argue whether Vlad's imprisonment was a genuine response to real evidence of Ottoman collusion, however unlikely that seems, or a cynical political maneuver by King Matthias to seize crusade funds and rid himself of a troublesome, unpredictable ally whom he could no longer control. The forged letters theory is widely favoured by modern scholars, but the full truth of Matthias's motives remains debated, tangled up in the murky finances and shifting alliances of 15th century Central European politics. What seems clear is that Vlad was, at least in significant part, a victim of a larger political game, betrayed not by the Ottomans he had fought, but by the Christian powers he had risked everything to defend. Yet this imprisonment, humiliating and unjust as it may have been, was not the end of Vlad's story. Far from it. Because something curious happened during those long years of captivity in Hungary. Over time, Vlad's situation slowly, steadily improved. The prisoner began incredibly to rehabilitate himself, to work his way back into favour, to transform from a disgraced captive into a figure once again worth backing. The wolf, it turned out, was not so easily kept in a cage forever, and the story of how Vlad clawed his way from prisoner back toward power, of the changes he made and the bargains he struck along the way, is a tale of patience and reinvention, every bit as remarkable as his years in the wilderness. His long confinement was about to become the strangest chapter of transformation in his entire strange life. Prison, for most men of Vlad's era, was a one-way door, the place where inconvenient princes quietly rotted until history forgot them. But Vlad was not most men, and his years of confinement, rather than ending his story, became a slow and peculiar chapter of reinvention, a patient campaign to transform himself from a disgraced captive back into a prince worth restoring. If his wilderness years taught him to wait, his prison years taught him to adapt, and the adaptations he made were nothing short of remarkable. Let us begin with the softening of his captivity itself. Although Vlad was initially imprisoned as an accused traitor, the conditions of his confinement appear to have eased considerably over the years. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. Over the course of his long imprisonment in Hungary, Vlad's status gradually shifted from that of a prisoner to something more like an honoured, if closely watched, guest of the royal court, and he was eventually released into a more comfortable form of house arrest in the Hungarian capital. The transformation was not instant, but the trajectory was unmistakable. The man who had entered captivity in chains slowly clawed his way back toward respectability, and the key to this rehabilitation lay in a combination of shifting politics and Vlad's own calculated manoeuvring. The politics worked in his favour over time. Down in Wallachia, his brother Radu the Handsome, the Ottoman-backed rival who had displaced him, eventually died, and the throne fell into the usual chaotic instability. As the years passed, King Matthias Corvinus began to see potential value once again in his caged wolf. An experienced, ferociously anti-Ottoman prince with a legitimate claim to Wallachia and a terrifying reputation was, after all, a useful asset to have on hand, especially as tensions with the Ottomans continued to simmer. The very qualities that had once made Vlad inconvenient, his implacable hatred of the Ottomans and his fearsome competence in fighting them, began to look attractive again as circumstances changed. Matthias, ever the pragmatist, started to reconsider whether the disgraced prince might be worth reactivating. But Vlad did not simply wait passively for politics to rescue him. He made a series of profound personal accommodations to secure his rehabilitation, and here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening, one that adds a fascinating wrinkle to the later vampire legend. In order to fully reconcile with King Matthias and cement his return to favour, Vlad converted from Eastern Orthodox Christianity to Roman Catholicism, the faith of the Hungarian court. This was a significant step, essentially changing his religious allegiance to align himself with his captor-turned-patron. And here is where the delicious irony for later legend builders comes in. In some strands of Eastern Orthodox belief, a person who abandoned the Orthodox faith could be regarded as cursed, and some folklore traditions held that such apostates were among those who might rise from the grave as undead revenants after death. Whether or not anyone at the time genuinely believed this about Vlad, it is a tantalizing thread that connects the historical prince ever so faintly. to the vampire mythology that would later attach itself to his name. Vlad's conversion, undertaken for coldly practical political reasons, may have inadvertently supplied one more thread for the eventual legend, a man who, in switching faiths, arguably damned himself in the eyes of his original church. The most striking evidence of Vlad's rehabilitation, however, was his marriage. To seal the reconciliation and bind Vlad firmly to the Hungarian cause, King Matthias arranged for Vlad to marry into the royal family, most likely to a cousin or relative of the king himself. This was an extraordinary elevation for a man who had recently been a disgraced prisoner accused of treason. To be married into the Hungarian royal house was to be publicly declared a trusted member of the court, a valued ally, and a prince worth backing for restoration. The marriage produced children, and it firmly reintegrated Vlad into the highest circles of Central European power. The wolf had not merely escaped his cage, he had been welcomed back to the table, given a royal bride, and positioned for a triumphant return. It was, by any measure, a stunning recovery from the depths of imprisonment and disgrace. Picture Vlad during these years of gradual restoration, a man in his 40s, now weathered by war and captivity, carefully rebuilding his life and his prospects within the very court that had once imprisoned him. There must have been an extraordinary discipline to it, a swallowing of pride, a patient playing of the long game that we have seen him play before. This was not the impulsive, defiant Vlad who had nailed turbans to envoys' heads. This was a chastened, strategic Vlad, one who had learned perhaps that survival sometimes required bending rather than breaking, conversion rather than defiance, marriage rather than massacre. Whether this represented genuine change or merely another mask worn for advantage, we cannot know, but the outward transformation was real enough. And so historians still argue whether Vlad's conversion to Catholicism and his integration into the Hungarian court represented a sincere, personal and political transformation, a genuine mellowing and adaptation of a man humbled by years of captivity, or merely a cynical, calculated performance, a set of expedient gestures made purely to secure his freedom and his eventual restoration to power, with no real change in the ferocious character beneath. Did prison change Vlad, or did he simply do whatever was necessary to get out and get back to his throne? The evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and scholars come down on different sides. Some see a man genuinely reshaped by his experiences. Others see the same old wolf, merely wearing a more respectable coat while he waited for his chance. What is not ambiguous is where all this careful rehabilitation was leading. The Ottoman threat was pressing once more, Wallachia was unstable, and Matthias Corvinus was ready to unleash his rehabilitated, remarried, freshly Catholic wolf back onto the frontier. After more than a decade of captivity and reinvention, Vlad was about to be handed one final chance to reclaim the throne he had lost, to return in triumph to the blood-soaked land he had ruled with such terrible efficiency. He was older now, and the world had shifted around him, but the fire of ambition and vengeance still burned. The prisoner was about to become a prince once more, riding south toward Wallachia for the third and final time, toward one last campaign that would end as so much of his life had, in violence, mystery, and enduring legend. There is something both magnificent and melancholy about a man returning to reclaim his life's great prize after more than a decade, in the wilderness of captivity, older now, greyer, wiser, perhaps, but still driven by the same fierce fire that had defined him since boyhood. Vlad's third and final bid for the throne of Wallachia has the quality of a last act, a grizzled warrior riding out one more time toward the only thing he had ever truly wanted, and it unfolds with all the drama and ambiguity that marked his entire remarkable life. By the mid-1470s, the pieces had finally fallen into place. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. In 1476, with the backing of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, and crucially in alliance with his old friend and cousin Stephen the Great of Moldavia, remember that bond forged in their shared exile all those years ago? Vlad launched a military campaign to retake the Wallachian throne, and he succeeded in claiming it for the third time late that year. It was a genuine coalition effort, drawing together the two great Christian powers of the region alongside Vlad's own forces and reputation. Stephen the Great, who had risen to become one of the most formidable rulers in the region and a celebrated defender against the Ottomans in his own right, threw his support behind his old companion, a touching reunion of the two young exiles who had once dreamed together of reclaiming their birthrights. Now, decades later, both had thrones, and the elder statesman Stephen was helping the newly freed Vlad claw his way back to power one final time. The campaign itself was a hard-fought affair. Wallachia was held at the time by an Ottoman-backed prince, and Vlad with his allied forces had to fight his way to the capital, defeating the rival and driving out the Ottoman-aligned faction. There is a certain fittingness to the fact that Vlad's final rise to power came through exactly the kind of warfare he had always excelled at. The clash of arms on the contested Wallachian frontier, the eternal struggle between the Christian north and the Ottoman south, with his little principality caught in the middle. He entered his capital once more, as prince restored to the seat he had lost so many years before the wolf returned to his lair at last. For a brief moment, it must have felt like vindication, like the culmination of everything he had endured, the exile, the imprisonment, the humiliation, all of it redeemed by this final triumphant return. But here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening, and it casts a long shadow over the triumph. Vlad's third reign was astonishingly brief, lasting only a matter of weeks, perhaps around 2 months, before it ended in his death. Think about that for a moment. After more than a decade of patient waiting, of religious conversion and royal marriage and careful political maneuvering, after fighting his way back to the throne with a grand coalition of allies, Vlad held his hard-won prize for only the briefest flicker of time before it was snatched away forever. There is something almost unbearably poignant about it, a man spending years to reclaim a throne only to sit on it for a handful of weeks. It is as if fate had granted him his heart's desire purely to demonstrate how fleeting all earthly power truly is, a lesson Vlad, of all people, should perhaps have already understood. The fragility of his position was in fact the core problem. Vlad returned to a Wallachia that had changed during his long absence. His terrifying reputation, which had once cowed the nobility into obedience, now inspired as much fear and resentment as loyalty. Many of the boyars remembered all too well what Vlad had done to their class during his earlier reign. The purges, the impalings, the wholesale destruction of the old aristocracy. They had no desire to submit again to such a ruler, and crucially, the allied forces that had helped install him, the Hungarian and Moldavian troops, did not remain to prop him up indefinitely. As Stephen's and Matthias's forces withdrew to attend to their own affairs, Vlad was left dangerously exposed. A prince with a fearsome name, but a thin and unreliable base of local support, surrounded by nobles who feared and hated him, and by Ottoman-backed enemies eager to topple him yet again. The sensory reality of these final weeks must have been tense and uneasy. Picture Vlad in his restored capital, aware that his grip was tenuous, that his allies were departing, that the very reputation that had once been his greatest weapon was now in his weakened state. A liability that made reconciliation with the local powers nearly impossible. He had built his rule on terror, and terror, as we discussed long ago, depends entirely on the ruler's ability to keep enforcing it. A weakened, exposed Vlad, without the overwhelming force to back up his fearsome image, was in a genuinely perilous position. The clock, though he may not have fully realized it, was already running out. And so historians still argue whether Vlad's third reign was doomed from the very start by the impossible contradictions of his situation. A hated tyrant returning to a land that no longer wanted him, propped up by allies who could not to stay, or whether given more time and better fortune he might have consolidated his power once again and re-established the iron order of his earlier rule. Was his swift downfall inevitable, or merely unlucky? Some scholars see a man who had outlived his moment, whose brutal methods no longer fit a changed political landscape. Others suspect that had he survived just a little longer, had the dice fallen slightly differently, the old wolf might have reasserted himself as fearsomely as ever. We will never know, because the reign was cut short with brutal suddenness. Within weeks of his triumphant return, Vlad the Impaler was dead, killed in battle or by treachery, in the confusing swirl of a winter campaign. His body reportedly mutilated his head, according to some accounts sent as a grisly trophy to the Sultan in Constantinople. The details of his death are as murky and contested as so much of his life, wrapped in conflicting accounts and unanswered questions. After everything, all the war and terror and cunning and survival, Vlad met an end as violent and ambiguous as the world he had inhabited. And the strange, shadowy circumstances of that death out there in the cold and the confusion of the battlefield form one of the most enduring mysteries of his entire legend. Endings in Vlad's world were rarely clean, and the end of the Impaler himself is perhaps the murkiest passage in his entire murky story. A death shrouded in such confusion and contradiction that even the most basic facts remain genuinely uncertain to this day. We know that he died sometime around the very end of 1476 or the beginning of 1477, out in the cold of a Wallachian winter, only weeks after reclaiming his throne. Almost everything beyond that dissolves into a fog of competing accounts, and it is precisely this uncertainty that makes his death such a fitting conclusion to a life defined by ambiguity. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening, insofar as anything about Vlad's death can be called a fact. Vlad III died in battle, or in an ambush somewhere near Bucharest, in the region of his principality, during a military engagement against Ottoman forces, or Ottoman-aligned Wallachians, sometime in the winter of 1476 to 1477. That much is broadly accepted. Beyond this bare skeleton, however, the accounts splinter into a dozen different possibilities, each with its own supporters and its own supporting sources, and no single version can be proven definitively correct. Let us walk through the leading theories because they are genuinely fascinating in their variety. One prominent account holds that Vlad fell in a pitched battle against an Ottoman army, or an Ottoman-backed Wallachian force cut down, while fighting, dying as he had lived sword in hand on the field of war. This is the heroic version, the death fitting for a warrior prince who had spent his life in combat. Another account suggests something far more sinister and characteristically treacherous. According to this version, Vlad was assassinated by his own disloyal boyars, the very nobles who feared and hated him, who saw their chance to be rid of the tyrant once and for all, and struck him down through betrayal rather than honest battle. Given Vlad's lifelong history of conflict with the Wallachian nobility, this theory has a grim plausibility to it. A man who lived by turning on others may well have died by others turning on him. There is an even stranger variant, and it is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening. According to one intriguing account, Vlad was killed by accident, mistaken for an Ottoman by his own men, in the chaos and confusion of battle. The story goes that Vlad, ever the master of Ottoman customs and language from his years in captivity, had disguised himself in Ottoman dress, perhaps to move among the enemy, or to observe the fighting when his own soldiers, failing to recognize their prince, beneath the enemy's clothing fell upon him and killed him in a tragic case of mistaken identity. There is a dark irony to this version that feels almost too perfect, the man who had spent his youth learning to think and dress like his enemies, ultimately destroyed by that very disguise, slain by the very people he was fighting to lead. Whether it is true or merely a poetic invention, it captures something essential about the tangled, ironic nature of Vlad's entire existence. What most accounts do seem to agree upon disturbingly is the fate of his body. According to multiple sources, Vlad's corpse was decapitated, and his head was preserved likely in honey to prevent decay, and sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, where it was reportedly displayed publicly as proof that the fearsome Impaler, the man who had once turned back an entire Ottoman army through sheer horror, was finally and definitively dead. There is a terrible symmetry to this, the prince who had built forests of the Impaled, ending as a severed head on display, a warning and a trophy, subjected in death to a version of the very public spectacle he had inflicted on so many others. The Sultan, one imagines, took considerable satisfaction in the sight of his old tormentor's head, final vengeance for the humiliations of that terrible summer campaign years before. And then there is the mystery of his burial, which deepens the enigma still further. Traditional accounts held that Vlad's body, or what remained of it, was buried at a monastery called Snagov, on an island in a lake near Bucharest, a peaceful and secluded spot that has drawn curious visitors and researchers for centuries. Yet when investigations were conducted at the supposed grave site, the results were confusing and inconclusive, with some excavations reportedly finding the tomb empty or containing unexpected remains, fueling endless speculation about where the Impaler truly lies. Various alternative burial sites have been proposed over the years, and the true resting place of Vlad the Impaler remains to this day genuinely unknown. One more unsolved puzzle in a life full of them. It is oddly fitting that a man so wrapped in legend and uncertainty should have no confirmed grave, as though history itself cannot quite pin him down, even in death. The sensory imagining of his end is a stark and lonely thing. Picture the winter battlefield, the cold and the mud and the confusion, the swirling chaos of a medieval melee, and somewhere in the midst of it the fall of the prince who had defied empires. There is no grand deathbed scene, no last words recorded for posterity, no dignified passing surrounded by loyal followers. Just violence, confusion, and then a severed head packed in honey carried south to a distant capital. For all his fearsome power and his enormous historical footprint, Vlad died as anonymously and chaotically as any common soldier, swallowed by the very violence he had wielded so masterfully throughout his life. And so inevitably historians still argue over virtually every detail of Vlad's death, debating whether he fell in honest battle or to treacherous assassination, whether the mistaken identity story holds any truth where his body was truly buried, and even the precise date of his demise. The sources are late, contradictory, and often based on hearsay, leaving the end of the Impaler as one of the great unresolved questions of 15th century history. It is a scholar's puzzle that may never be solved, and perhaps that is appropriate for a figure who has always existed more in the realm of legend than of documented certainty. But here is the truly remarkable thing about Vlad's death. It was not in any meaningful sense an ending at all, because although the man died in that cold winter of 1476, obscure and mutilated, his legend was only just beginning its strangest and most enduring transformation. 400 years later, in the imagination of a Victorian novelist searching for a name to give his aristocratic monster, the forgotten Wallachian warlord would be reborn as something no 15th century mind could ever have conceived an immortal creature of. The knight whose name would eclipse the historical man entirely and echo across the whole world. Here is one of the great accidents of literary history, the kind of thing that makes you marvel at how reputations tumble down the centuries in ways no one could ever predict. A 15th century warlord dead and largely forgotten outside his own corner of Eastern Europe was plucked from obscurity 400 years later by an Irish theatre manager writing a horror novel. Given a starring role he never auditioned for, and transformed into the most famous vampire in the history of the world. The journey from Vlad the Impaler to Count Dracula is a strange and winding one, and it is worth untangling carefully because the connection is far looser and far more fascinating than most people assume. Let us start with the man who did it. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. The novel Dracula was written by the Irish author Bram Stoker and published in 1897, and it introduced the world to Count Dracula, the aristocratic vampire from Transylvania, who has since become the archetype of the entire vampire genre. Stoker was a theatre manager by profession, working for the famous actor Henry Irving in London, and he wrote his Gothic masterpiece over several years, drawing on a wide range of influences: folklore earlier, vampire fiction, and his own dark imagination. The novel was moderately successful in its own time, but went on especially through the 20th century and the rise of cinema to become one of the most influential horror stories ever written, spawning countless films, plays, and adaptations that cemented Dracula as a permanent fixture of popular culture. Now the crucial question: how much of the historical Vlad the Impaler actually made it into Stoker's Count Dracula? And the answer, which surprises many people, is remarkably little. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula, and he seems to have known at least a few scraps about a fierce historical figure associated with it. But the character of the Count is overwhelmingly a work of imagination and Gothic convention, not a portrait of the real Vlad. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening, and it demolishes a very common misconception. There is strong evidence that Stoker originally intended to name his vampire something else entirely, possibly Count Wampir, and that he came across the name Dracula relatively late in his research, most likely in a book about the history of the region that mentioned the name and noted in a footnote or aside that it meant devil in the local tongue. Stoker, delighted by this sinister etymology, adopted the name for its menacing sound and its diabolical connotations, without necessarily incorporating much of the actual history of the man who had borne it. In other words, Stoker took the name and its devilish meaning, that very same Drac we discussed at the beginning of our night together, and left almost everything else behind. Consider how little the two figures actually share. The historical Vlad was a warlord and prince, who fought battles, ruled a principality, and used impalement as a tool of war and governance. He was not associated in any historical sense with drinking blood, with immortality, with turning into a bat, with fearing garlic or crucifixes, or with any of the supernatural vampire traits that define Stoker's count. Those elements came from entirely different sources, from Eastern European vampire folklore, from earlier vampire literature such as the works that preceded Stoker, and from Stoker's own creative invention. The Count's aristocratic castle in the Carpathians, his hypnotic menace, his predatory seduction, all of it is Gothic fiction, bearing essentially no relationship to the life of the actual 15th century prince. Stoker essentially hung a real historical name on a completely fictional supernatural monster, and the two have been hopelessly entangled in the popular imagination ever since. The confusion has been compounded enormously by the tourism and entertainment industries, which have every incentive to blur the line between the historical Vlad and the fictional Count. Consider the famous Bran castle in Romania, marketed relentlessly to tourists as Dracula's castle, complete with vampire souvenirs and spooky ambience. In historical reality, there is little to no evidence that Vlad the Impaler had any significant connection to Bran Castle at all. It is a striking, dramatic-looking fortress that fits the Gothic image beautifully, but the association with Vlad is largely a modern marketing invention, capitalizing on the Dracula legend to draw visitors. The actual fortress most associated with Vlad, that mountaintop Poenari castle reportedly built by his enslaved boyars, remember them, is far less famous and far less convenient for tour buses. The gap between the historical truth and the tourist-friendly legend could hardly be wider, and yet the legend, as legends do, has almost entirely swallowed the truth in the popular mind. There is a further irony worth savouring here. By borrowing Vlad's name and attaching it to his immortal vampire, Stoker accidentally guaranteed that the historical Vlad would achieve a kind of immortality of his own, though not at all the kind he might have wanted or recognized. The fierce Christian defender of Wallachia, the man who saw himself as a warrior for his faith and his homeland, has been transformed in global consciousness into an undead, blood-drinking aristocrat, a creature of pure supernatural horror. It is difficult to imagine a transformation the real Vlad would have found more baffling or more offensive. The devout, ferociously anti-Ottoman prince reduced to a caped monster hissing at crucifixes. And yet, without Stoker, without that borrowed name and its accidental resurrection, Vlad might well have faded into the same obscurity as countless other regional warlords of his era. Dracula the vampire paradoxically kept Vlad the Impaler famous, and so historians and literary scholars still argue over exactly how much Bram Stoker really knew about the historical Vlad and how deliberately he drew on his life, with some scholars arguing that Stoker incorporated meaningful historical details and others insisting that the connection is essentially superficial, limited mostly to the borrowed name and its sinister meaning. The debate hinges on fragmentary evidence about Stoker's research notes and sources, and it remains genuinely unresolved. What is clear is that the popular belief that Count Dracula is simply a fictionalized version of Vlad the Impaler vastly overstates a connection that is in truth far thinner and more accidental than the legend suggests. This tangled relationship between the real man and the fictional monster brings us to one of the most interesting questions of our entire journey. If the vampire is largely an invention and the historical Vlad was something quite different, then who was he really and how should he be remembered? The answer, it turns out, depends enormously on who you ask and where in the world you happen to be standing, because to some he remains a monster and to others, remarkably, he is a national hero. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with this idea that the same historical figure can be simultaneously and sincerely a bloodthirsty monster in one culture's memory and a beloved national hero in another's, with no easy way to reconcile the two. Yet that is precisely the situation with Vlad the Impaler. And understanding this profound divergence in how he is remembered tells us something important, not only about Vlad, but about the very nature of history, memory, and the stories nations choose to tell about themselves. Let us begin with the heroic Vlad, because for many people around the world raised on the vampire legend, this version comes as a genuine surprise. Here is your mainstream historical fact for the evening. In Romania, Vlad III is widely regarded as a national hero celebrated for his fierce defense of Wallachian independence against Ottoman domination, his imposition of law and order in a chaotic land, and his defiant courage in standing up to a vastly more powerful empire. Romanian schoolchildren learn about him as a patriotic figure, a defender of the homeland and of Christian Europe against foreign conquest. There are statues honoring him, and his image appears in contexts of national pride rather than horror. From this perspective, Vlad's severity is understood as the necessary harshness of a ruler facing existential threats, a strong leader who did what was required to protect his people in a brutal age. The impalings and the terror are not denied, but they are contextualized as the grim tools of survival wielded against traitors, criminals, and foreign invaders in defense of the nation. To many Romanians, Vlad is less Dracula the vampire and more a founding father figure, a symbol of resistance and independence. This heroic interpretation gained particular force during certain periods of Romanian history when national pride and independence were especially salient themes. Here is your quirky fringe tidbit for the evening. During the communist era in Romania, particularly under the rule of Nicolae Ceausescu in the later 20th century, the historical Vlad was actively promoted and rehabilitated as a national hero and a strong independent leader, partly as a way of fostering nationalist sentiment, and some have suggested, partly because an authoritarian ruler found it useful, to celebrate a historical strong man who imposed harsh order and defied foreign powers. The regime distinguished sharply between the heroic historical Vlad and the frivolous foreign vampire legend, which was sometimes viewed with irritation as a Western distortion that trivialized a serious national figure. There is a certain irony in an authoritarian government embracing a ruler famous for extreme methods of enforcing obedience. But the propaganda value of a defiant national hero was evidently too useful to pass up. This deliberate promotion helped cement Vlad's heroic status in modern Romanian consciousness, even as the rest of the world knew him primarily as a monster. Now let us turn to the monstrous Vlad, the version dominant in Western and global popular culture. Here, shaped by those hostile German pamphlets we discussed earlier, and later by the vampire legend, Vlad is remembered overwhelmingly as a figure of cruelty and horror, a byword for sadistic tyranny, the Impaler, whose very name conjures images of forests of the dead. In this telling, the emphasis falls entirely on the atrocities, the mass impalings, the reputed torture, the sheer scale of the killing, with little attention paid to the political context or the defensive rationale that Romanian memory emphasizes. The Western Vlad is a villain, pure and simple, a historical bogeyman whose deeds are recounted to shock and horrify rather than to celebrate. And through the vampire connection, this monstrous reputation has been amplified and distorted still further, fusing the historical cruelty with supernatural evil until the two became nearly indistinguishable in the popular mind. So, which is the real Vlad, the hero or the monster? The uncomfortable but honest answer is that both interpretations rest on genuine historical foundations and neither can be simply dismissed. Vlad really did defend Wallachia against the Ottomans with remarkable courage and tactical skill, really did impose order on a lawless land, and really was, from a certain patriotic perspective, a defender of his homeland and his faith. And Vlad really did employ extreme systematic cruelty, really did impale large numbers of people, and really was, by the standards of almost any age, an exceptionally brutal ruler. The hero and the monster are not two different men. They are two different framings of the same complicated, violent, effective, and terrifying individual. Which framing you emphasize depends heavily on your perspective, your cultural background, and the aspects of his rule you choose to foreground. This divergence illustrates a profound truth about how history works. The way a historical figure is remembered is never simply a neutral recording of facts. It is always shaped by who is doing the remembering, what purposes that memory serves, and which stories a culture finds useful or meaningful to tell. Vlad's Romanian admirers are not wrong about his defense of the homeland, and his Western detractors are not wrong about his cruelty. They are simply looking at the same man through different lenses, emphasizing different truths, and arriving at radically different conclusions. The vampire legend adds yet another layer, a purely fictional distortion that has for much of the world overwritten both the heroic and the monstrous historical interpretations with something largely invented. And so historians still argue, and probably always will, over how to weigh Vlad's genuine achievements as a ruler and defender against the undeniable brutality of his methods, and over whether it is even possible or appropriate to render a single moral verdict on a figure so thoroughly shaped by the extreme violence of his time and place. Some emphasize that Vlad's cruelty must be judged in the context of a savage era when brutal methods were commonplace among rulers. Others insist that even by the standards of his own violent age, Vlad stood out as exceptionally severe, and that context cannot fully excuse the scale of his atrocities. The debate reflects deeper and genuinely difficult questions about how we judge historical figures, how much weight to give context, and whether the ends of order and defense can ever justify such extreme means. There is no consensus, and there likely never will be, which is perhaps as it should be for a figure this complex. What remains when we strip away both the heroic myth and the monstrous legend and the vampire fantasy layered on top of everything is a human being, a real man who lived and fought and suffered and inflicted suffering in a specific and terrible time and place. And it is to that man, the person beneath all the accumulated stories, that we turn for the final reckoning of our long night together, as we try gently and honestly to see Vlad not as hero or monster or vampire, but simply as he was. So here we are at the end of our long journey together, and it is time to set aside the vampire and the monster and the national hero, all those competing masks we have examined through the night, and try as gently and honestly as we can to glimpse the human being who wore them all. Because beneath every legend there was once simply a man, and that man deserves at least an attempt at understanding before we let him rest. Who was Vlad really when we strip everything else away? Here is your final mainstream historical fact for our journey, and it is perhaps the most grounding one of all. Vlad III was a 15th century ruler of a small embattled principality, a man shaped by extraordinary circumstances of political instability, foreign captivity, family tragedy, and constant existential threat, who ruled through a combination of genuine political skill, real military talent, and extreme calculated violence during a period when such violence was tragically a common instrument of power across much of the world. He was not a supernatural creature, not a cartoon villain, and not a spotless patriot. He was a product of his time and his experiences, a highly capable and deeply ruthless individual, navigating an almost impossibly dangerous world with the tools and the mindset that world had given him. His cruelty was real, and so was his courage. His brutality was genuine, and so was his effectiveness. He contained all of these things at once, as complicated people so often do. Consider the forces that made him. A childhood spent as a hostage, his very survival dependent on forces beyond his control. The murder of his father and the horrifying death of his brother at the hands of treacherous nobles. Years of exile and uncertainty, followed by more than a decade of imprisonment by a supposed ally. A lifetime spent as a small piece caught between two of the mightiest powers of the age, forever balancing on the knife edge of survival. Is it any wonder that such a life produced a man of such fierce, uncompromising, and often terrible character? This is not to excuse what he did, for the suffering he caused was real and vast, but it is to understand it, to see the human logic, however dark, that ran beneath the legend. Here is your final quirky tidbit to carry away with you. Some scholars have noted that Vlad's obsessive concern with order, honesty, and the punishment of betrayal may reflect the deep psychological wounds of a man who had himself been betrayed again and again by nobles, by allies, by the very structures of power that should have protected him. The man who punished treachery so ferociously had been its victim more than almost anyone. And so one final time historians still argue over the ultimate meaning of Vlad's life, over whether he should be understood primarily as a tragic product of a brutal age doing what he believed necessary to survive and protect his realm, or as a genuinely exceptional practitioner of cruelty whose personal darkness exceeded even the harsh norms of his violent era. This debate, like so many we have encountered tonight, will likely never be settled, and perhaps it need not be. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is that Vlad was both more and less than his legend, a real and complicated human being who has been buried beneath centuries of storytelling until the man himself has become almost impossible to see clearly. What we can do, what we have tried to do together through this long night, is to hold both the truth and the legend in mind at once, to appreciate the fascinating gap between them, and to remember that behind every monster of history there is usually a human story far stranger and sadder than any fiction. And now, as our journey draws gently to its close, let the torchlight begin to dim. Let the cold mountains of Wallachia soften and recede into the mist, their sharp edges blurring and growing distant, the way the details of a dream slip quietly away in the moments after waking. The forests grow still and silent now, the old battlefields long since grown over with grass and wildflowers. The fortresses crumbled into peaceful ruins, where only the wind moves through the empty stones. All the fury and the fear, all the clashing armies and the terrible spectacles have faded now into the deep and gentle quiet of the past, where they can no longer trouble anyone, where they rest complete and finished, held safely in the amber of memory. The man we followed through this night, with all his terror and his genius, his defiance and his suffering, has been at rest for more than 500 years, and whatever storms once raged within him have long since grown calm. The Danube flows on peacefully beneath the stars, as it has for countless ages, indifferent and serene. The old quarrels between empires have dissolved into history, the tribute unpaid, the stakes long rotted away, the golden cup gathered back into legend. There is nothing left now to fear from any of it, nothing but a fascinating story to hold quietly in your mind as you drift towards sleep, a tale of a distant time and a distant land that can touch you, not at all here in the warmth and the safety of your own bed. So, let the last of the imagery fade, the stars above old Wallachia dimming one by one, the mist settling soft and grey over the sleeping hills, everything growing quieter and quieter still. You are here and you are safe, and the whole long, turbulent past is at rest, as gentle now as a closing book. Let your breathing slow, let your thoughts grow soft and formless. Let the weight of the day melt away into the mattress beneath you. The world is quiet now. The story is told. There is nothing more to do, and nowhere more to be, only the deep and peaceful dark wrapping around you like the softest of blankets. Rest now. The world is quiet, and it is time at last for deep and gentle sleep.